The deafening blast of a shotgun tore through the morning stillness as Maggie Zellner stared down the smoking barrel, her trembling hands betraying the confident stance she fought to maintain. The man who had threatened to take everything from her lay motionless in the dust of what had once been her father's general store in Cottonwood Springs, Arizona Territory, 1878. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the parched wooden floorboards as the echo of the gunshot faded into a silence more terrifying than the violence that preceded it. "I had no choice," she whispered to the empty store, as if the shelves of canned goods and barrels of flour might absolve her of what she'd done. Trembling, she lowered the shotgun and stepped backward until her spine pressed against the counter that had been her post for the past 3 years, since her father had taken ill and left her to manage their struggling business. At 23, Maggie had never imagined her life would come to this moment standing over a dead man, the future she'd carefully pieced together now shattered beyond recognition. Sheriff Thomas would believe her plea of self-defense. Everyone in town knew that Frank Hollister had been terrorizing local businesses for protection money, but it wouldn't matter. The killing would follow her, mark her. In a town as small as Cottonwood Springs, she'd forever be the woman who shot a man dead, no matter how justified, as the reality of her situation settled upon her shoulders like a leaden cloak. Maggie sank to the floor, her calico skirt pooling around her. The weight of her father's illness, the failing store, and now this violence crushed against her chest, making each breath a struggle. She had no future here, not anymore. The bell above the door jingled, jarring her from her thoughts. Instinctively, she raised the shotgun again, her knuckles white against the worn wood. "Don't shoot," came a deep voice, steady and calm. "I heard the commotion, thought someone might need help." The figure silhouetted in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, blocking the harsh morning sunlight. As he stepped inside, his features came into focus: sun-weathered skin, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a strong jawline shadowed with several days' worth of beard. He wore the dust of the trail, his clothes faded from sun and wear, but there was nothing worn about the way he carried himself or the careful assessment in his gaze as it moved from Maggie to the dead man and back again. "Blake Jameson," he offered by way of introduction, his hat now in his hands as he gave a small, respectful nod. "I'm passing through, heard the shot." His eyes, kind despite their wariness, met hers. "Are you hurt, madam?" Maggie's throat constricted, the words trapped behind the lump of fear. She shook her head, still clutching the shotgun. "He came for money," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said he'd burn the place down with me in it if I didn't pay. I refused. He grabbed me. She broke off, unable to finish. Blake nodded slowly, as if he'd heard similar stories before. Without asking permission, he crossed to where Frank Hollister lay, knelt beside the body, and checked for a pulse he surely knew wouldn't be there. "Self-defense," he stated simply, standing and wiping his hands on his denim-clad thighs. "Sheriff will see it that way too." Maggie laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "It won't matter, you don't understand. This town, it has a long memory and little forgiveness. My father's dying, this store is all we have, and now—" She gestured helplessly at the body. "There's nothing left for me here." Blake studied her with those storm-gray eyes, taking in her proud posture despite the circumstances, the intelligence in her gaze, the determination in the set of her jaw. "You're right," he said after a long moment. "I don't understand this town, but I understand starting over." He moved toward the door. "I'll fetch the sheriff. Sit tight." Before Maggie could respond, he was gone, the bells signaling his departure. She remained on the floor, the shotgun across her lap, waiting for the judgment that would soon follow. Sheriff Thomas arrived within minutes, Blake trailing behind him. The lawman's face was grim as he surveyed the scene, but his voice was gentle when he addressed Maggie. "Miss Zellner, Blake here's told me what happened. Hollister's been causing trouble all over the county. Reckon it was only a matter of time before someone stood up to him." He sighed heavily. "Still, there'll have to be an inquest, formality, you understand." Maggie nodded numbly. She understood all too well. The whispers would start immediately, spreading through town like wildfire. By sundown, everyone would know. By week's end, the customers who still patronized Zellner's general store would find reasons to shop elsewhere. What about her father? Blake asked, surprising Maggie with his continued interest in her predicament. Doc says it's consumption, Sheriff Thomas replied, his voice dropping. Won't be long now. The reality of her situation crashed over Maggie anew, her father wasting away in the small room behind the store, the business failing, and now this. The tears she'd been holding back threatened to spill. I'll need to close the store for the day, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. And someone should stay with my father while I deal with this. She gestured vaguely toward Hollister's body, still unable to look directly at what she'd done. I can help, Blake offered, again catching her off guard. I've got nowhere pressing to be. Sheriff Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on the cowboy's unexpected offer. Instead, he said, I'll send Doc Jenkins over for your father and the undertaker for Hollister. Blake, you help Miss Zellner close up shop. I'll be back later for her statement. After the sheriff left with a promise to return, an awkward silence fell between Maggie and the stranger who had inexplicably inserted himself into her tragedy. Why are you helping me? She finally asked, setting the shotgun aside and rising to her feet, brushing dust from her skirt with trembling hands. Blake shrugged, a simple lift of powerful shoulders. Been in tough spots myself. Know what it's like to face them alone. He moved to the door, turning the sign to closed before drawing the shade. Besides, seems to me you could use a friend right about now. Maggie wanted to protest that they weren't friends, they were strangers who had met under the worst possible circumstances, but she couldn't deny the truth of his words. She did need someone, and at this moment, this quiet cowboy with the storm-gray eyes was all she had. Thank you, she said instead, her voice small but sincere. Blake nodded, his expression softening slightly. Now, about your father, should we move him somewhere more comfortable? For the first time since the shooting, Maggie felt a flicker of something other than despair. Not hope she was too pragmatic for that, but perhaps a momentary reprieve from the crushing weight of her circumstances. Yes, she agreed, leading the way to the back room where her father lay. That would be kind. In the days that followed, Blake Jameson proved to be more than just a passing Good Samaritan. He stayed in Cottonwood Springs, taking a room at the boarding house and spending his days helping Maggie manage the store and care for her ailing father. The inquest into Frank Hollister's death was brief, with the verdict of justified homicide surprising no one. But as Maggie had predicted, the town's reaction was less forgiving. Business dwindled to almost nothing. Regular customers found excuses not to meet her eyes when they passed on the street. The whispers followed her everywhere, some painting her as a cold-blooded killer, others speculating about her relationship with the handsome cowboy who seemed to have appointed himself her protector. A week after the shooting, Maggie's father took a turn for the worse. Doc Jenkins was summoned, but his grave expression as he emerged from the sick room told Maggie everything she needed to know. He's asking for you, the doctor said gently, packing away his stethoscope, and for the cowboy too, strangely enough. Maggie glanced at Blake, who stood nearby, his face unreadable. He had been a constant presence, quiet and steady, asking for nothing while giving everything she needed: his strength, his time, his unwavering support. In just a week, he had become indispensable to her, though she dared not examine too closely what that might mean. Together, they entered the sick room. Thomas Zellner lay propped against pillows, his once robust frame wasted by disease, his breath shallow and labored. But his eyes, so like Maggie's own hazel ones, were clear and focused as they fixed first on his daughter, then on Blake. You've been kind to my girl, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Seen how you look after her. Blake shifted uncomfortably but didn't deny it. Anyone would do the same. Thomas shook his head weakly. No, not anyone, not in this town, not after what happened. He reached for Maggie's hand, his skin paper thin against hers. Maggie girl, there's nothing left for you here. The store's failing, I'm failing, and after Hollister. He trailed off, overcome by a coughing fit that left specks of blood on his handkerchief. Pa, don't talk like that, Maggie protested, though she knew the truth of his words. We'll manage, we always have. Not this time, Thomas said firmly once he'd caught his breath. This time you need to look ahead, find a new path. His gaze shifted to Blake. You're heading west, aren't you, son? Blake nodded. California, eventually. Got some land waiting there. Inheritance from an uncle I barely knew. Thomas's eyes lit with a spark of their old shrewdness. Take her with you, Maggie gasped, shocked by her father's bluntness. Pa, you can't just— I can and I will, Thomas interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Blake, my Maggie's smart, hardworking, she knows business, could be an asset to you setting up that land. He squeezed Maggie's hand. And you, daughter, you said yourself there's no future for you here. Maybe there's one out west. Blake was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered the dying man's unexpected proposal. Finally, he spoke, his words measured and careful. Sir, with all due respect, that's a decision for your daughter to make, but if she wants to come with me when I leave, she'd be welcome. He turned to Maggie, his gray eyes serious. No strings, no expectations, just safe passage to California and a fresh start. Maggie felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Leave Cottonwood Springs, travel west with a man she barely knew. It was madness. And yet, as she looked around the small room that had been her father's prison these past months, as she thought of the store that was slowly bleeding them dry, as she remembered the coldness in the eyes of people she'd known all her life, perhaps madness was preferable to staying. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied with this non-answer. Time's the one thing I don't have much of, Maggie girl, but you take what you need. Just promise me you'll consider it. I promise, Maggie whispered, bending to kiss his forehead. Later that night, after Doc Jenkins had gone and her father had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, Maggie found Blake sitting on the store's small back porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. Did you mean it? She asked without preamble, settling onto the step beside him. About taking me with you. Blake didn't look at her, his gaze still fixed on the heavens. I did. You deserve better than what this town's giving you. You don't know me, Maggie pointed out, drawing her shawl tighter against the desert night's chill. I could be terrible company. I might talk incessantly or snore or have deplorable habits you can't stand. That drew a small smile from him, the first she'd seen. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and lighting his eyes. All of that might be true, but I know enough. I know you're brave. I know you're loyal. Look how you've cared for your father. I know you're hardworking. That's more than enough to start with. Maggie studied his profile, trying to understand this man who had walked into her life at its darkest moment and offered a glimmer of light. Why did you stay? You could have reported what happened to the sheriff and moved on. No one would have blamed you. Blake was quiet for so long that Maggie thought he might not answer. When he finally did, his voice was low, tinged with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. I know what it's like to have nowhere to turn, to feel like the world's turned its back on you. He finally looked at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been before. 5 years ago, I lost everything in a single night. My wife, my daughter, our home, all gone in a fire while I was away, came back to nothing but ashes and blame. Maggie's heart constricted at the pain evident in his words. I'm so sorry, she whispered. He nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. After that, I drifted, took whatever work I could find, didn't matter what it was as long as it kept me moving, kept me from thinking too much. His hands, strong and calloused, flexed restlessly in his lap. Then my mother's brother died, left me land in California I didn't even know he had. First time in 5 years I've had something to move toward instead of away from. The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep within Maggie. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it was to stand at the crossroads of what was and what could be, to make choices that would forever alter the course of a life. I've never been more than 50 miles from Cottonwood Springs, she confessed. The idea of California, it's like something from a storybook, not real. It's real, Blake assured her. Different from here, but real, greener. The air smells of salt and possibility. He hesitated, then added, You'd like it, I think. For the first time since the shooting, Maggie allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the confines of her current circumstances. A future where she wasn't defined by one terrible moment, where she could build something new, be someone new. "I would have to sell the store," she said slowly, thinking aloud. "What's left of it anyway? There wouldn't be much after settling Pa's medical debts, but enough for a stake, perhaps." Blake nodded, not pushing, simply allowing her to work through the practicalities. "And Pa," her voice broke. "He doesn't have much time. I couldn't leave until—" "Of course not," Blake agreed immediately. "I'm in no rush. California's waited this long for me, it can wait a bit longer." Maggie looked at him, really looked at him, seeing beyond the weathered exterior to the man beneath, a man who had known profound loss yet still found the capacity for kindness, for patience, for offering a lifeline to a stranger in need. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Blake's smile returned, smaller but no less transformative. "You haven't said yes yet." "I haven't said no either," Maggie pointed out, a hint of her old spirit returning. They sat in companionable silence after that, watching the stars wheel overhead, each lost in thoughts of what might come next. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Maggie felt something unfamiliar stir within her breast, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin, possibility. Thomas Zellner passed peacefully 3 days later, his hand clasped in Maggie's, Blake standing sentinel nearby. His last words to his daughter were a reminder of her promise to consider leaving, to seek a life beyond the constraints of Cottonwood Springs. The funeral was sparsely attended, a few loyal customers, Doc Jenkins, Sheriff Thomas, and, surprisingly, Mrs. Abernathy from the boarding house where Blake was staying. Maggie stood dry-eyed beside the grave, Blake a solid presence at her side, as Reverend Peterson spoke of resurrection and eternal life. She heard little of the sermon, her mind occupied with the reality of being truly alone in the world, save for the taciturn cowboy who had appointed himself her champion. In the weeks that followed, Maggie made her decision. She would sell what remained of Zellner's general store, settle her father's debts, and accompany Blake Jameson to California. The announcement was met with raised eyebrows and whispered speculation, but Maggie found she cared little for the town's opinion. They had shown their true colors when she needed them most. She owed them nothing now. The sale of the store yielded less than she'd hoped, but more than she'd feared. After paying Doc Jenkins and the undertaker, she was left with a modest sum enough to contribute to their journey and perhaps establish a small business once they reached their destination. Blake insisted she keep her money separate from his, that this arrangement was about mutual benefit rather than dependence. "Partners," he said firmly when she tried to contribute to their supplies. "That's what your father suggested, and that's what will be. You keep your stake for California." "I've got enough for the journey." On a crisp autumn morning, with the desert coming alive around them, Maggie Zellner closed the door on her past and climbed aboard the wagon Blake had purchased for their journey. Her few possessions, clothing, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, and a small box of keepsakes took up little space among the supplies Blake had meticulously gathered. "Ready?" he asked, glancing at her from beneath the brim of his hat. Maggie took one last look at the town that had been her whole world. The spire of the church, the false fronts of the businesses lining Main Street, the dusty roads she knew like the lines on her palm, all of it suddenly seemed small, confined, a cage she was finally escaping. "Ready," she confirmed, her voice steady despite the riot of emotions beneath her composed exterior. Blake nodded, flicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, carrying them away from Cottonwood Springs and toward an uncertain future. The journey west was arduous in ways Maggie had never imagined. The vast emptiness of the desert, the punishing sun by day and bone-chilling cold by night, the constant vigilance required against threats, both human and natural, all tested her resolve. But with each passing mile, she felt the weight of Cottonwood Springs and its judgment receding, replaced by a growing sense of freedom she had never before experienced. Blake proved to be an ideal traveling companion, capable, prepared for any contingency, and respectful of her privacy and independence. They developed a comfortable routine. He handled the driving and hunting, she managed the cooking and kept their meager possessions organized. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in companionable silence. Maggie learned that Blake had been a rancher before the fire that claimed his family, that he still woke sometimes with their names on his lips, that he could identify any star in the night sky, and that he had a surprisingly melodic singing voice, though he rarely indulged it. In turn, she shared stories of growing up as the daughter of a storekeeper, of her mother's death from fever when Maggie was just 12, of her dreams of someday seeing the ocean. They were 3 weeks into their journey, camped beside a small creek in western Arizona territory when their partnership faced its first serious test. Blake had gone to check their perimeter before turning in for the night, leaving Maggie to bank the fire. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. 3 riders, moving fast and purposefully toward their camp. Blake materialized from the darkness, rifle in hand, positioning himself between Maggie and the approaching threat. "Get behind the wagon," he instructed quietly. "Take the shotgun." Maggie did as he asked, her heart hammering against her ribs as she retrieved the same shotgun that had ended Frank Hollister's life. The riders slowed as they approached, clearly having spotted the campfire from a distance. "Evening," called the lead rider, a burly man with a thick mustache and an even thicker accent that Maggie couldn't quite place. "Mind if we share your fire? Been riding hard all day." Blake's stance remained wary, his rifle not quite pointed at the newcomers but ready to be raised in an instant. "Where you headed?" "California," the man replied easily. "Heard there's work in the mines there." "Long way to ride in the dark," Blake observed, his tone neutral but his posture alert. The man shrugged. "Prefer traveling at night, cooler." His gaze shifted to Maggie, partially visible behind the wagon. "Evening, madam. Didn't realize there was a lady present." Something in his tone, a certain oily quality, a too familiar leer set Maggie's nerves jangling. She tightened her grip on the shotgun. "You're welcome to water your horses," Blake said carefully, "but we're turning in for the night. There's another good camping spot about 2 miles west of here by the big stand of cottonwoods." The lead rider's friendly expression hardened slightly. "Seems mighty inhospitable, friend." "We're just looking for a place to rest." "And I'm just suggesting one," Blake replied, his voice taking on an edge Maggie hadn't heard before. 2 miles west, can't miss it." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the pop of embers in the fire. Maggie held her breath, acutely aware of how exposed they were, how easily a situation like this could turn deadly. Finally, the lead rider spat into the dirt. "Come on, boys, reckon we're not welcome here." He fixed Blake with a hard stare. "Sleep light, friend." The 3 wheeled their horses around and rode off into the darkness. Blake maintained his vigilant stance until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then moved swiftly to Maggie's side. "We need to move," he said urgently, already gathering their belongings. "They'll be back and with more friends." Maggie didn't question his assessment. She had seen the malice in the lead rider's eyes, had recognized the threat in his parting words. Working quickly and efficiently, they broke camp, doused the fire, and hitched the horses to the wagon. Within 20 minutes, they were moving again, Blake guiding them off the main trail and into rougher terrain that would be harder to follow in the dark. They traveled through the night, stopping only when dawn broke to rest the horses. Blake insisted on keeping watch while Maggie caught a few hours of fitful sleep, her dreams haunted by shadowy riders and the echoing blast of a shotgun. When she woke, she found Blake sitting nearby, his face drawn with fatigue but his eyes alert as they scanned their surroundings. "You need to sleep," she told him, sitting up and pushing her tangled hair from her face. "I can keep watch." Blake shook his head. "Not yet, need to put more distance between us and them." Maggie studied him, noting the stubborn set of his jaw. "You think they're still following? Maybe." "Maybe not, but I won't risk your safety on a maybe." He stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of immobility. "We'll head north for a while, away from the main routes. It'll add time to our journey, but it's safer." The protectiveness in his voice stirred something warm in Maggie's chest, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. "Thank you," she said softly, "for looking out for me." Blake's expression softened, the weariness in his eyes momentarily replaced by something deeper, more complex. "Partners, remember, that's what we agreed." But as they continued their journey, taking a more circuitous route to avoid potential pursuers, Maggie found herself wondering if partners was still the right word for what they were becoming to each other. There was a growing ease between them, a comfortable familiarity that went beyond mere traveling companions. She caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring the strong line of his shoulders, the quiet competence with which he handled every challenge, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally broke through his serious demeanor. And sometimes, she caught him watching her too, his storm-gray eyes quickly looking away when she noticed, a faint color rising beneath his tanned skin. Those moments sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with danger or fear, and everything to do with the awakening of feelings she had thought long buried. They reached the California border as winter was setting in, the desert giving way to more varied terrain, rolling hills covered in scrub, occasional stands of trees, and in the distance, the promise of mountains. The weather turned cooler, the nights longer, and their stops more frequent as they navigated unfamiliar territory. It was during one such stop, as they camped beside a small, clear stream, that the fragile balance between them shifted. Blake had been teaching Maggie to fish, standing behind her to guide her movements as she cast the line into the water. His proximity, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the gentle strength of his hands over hers, the brush of his breath against her ear as he murmured instructions, awakened a yearning so intense it nearly took her breath away. When she turned her head slightly, intending to ask a question about her technique, she found his face mere inches from hers, his eyes dark with an emotion that mirrored the one coursing through her veins. For a breathless moment, they remained frozen, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility. Then Blake stepped back, clearing his throat, the spell broken. "You've got it now," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Just be patient. Fish can sense if you're too eager." Maggie nodded, unable to trust her voice, her hands suddenly clumsy on the fishing rod. The moment passed, but its echo lingered between them, coloring their interactions with a new awareness that neither seemed ready to acknowledge. That night, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them was different, charged, expectant, full of things unsaid. Finally, Maggie gathered her courage. "Blake," she began, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames, "I need to ask you something." He looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his expression guarded. "What is it?" Maggie took a deep breath. "When we reach your land, what happens then to our arrangement?" Blake set the knife aside, giving her question the consideration it deserved. "That depends," he said slowly, "on what you want to happen." "What I want," Maggie repeated, surprised by his answer. "Yes." His eyes met hers across the fire, steady and serious. "When I offered to take you with me, I meant it as a chance for a new beginning, no strings, no expectations." "That hasn't changed." Maggie studied him, trying to read the truth behind his careful words. "And if I wanted to move on once we arrive, find my own way," something flickered across his face, disappointment perhaps, or resignation, but his voice remained even. "Then I'd wish you well and be grateful for your company on the journey." "And if I wanted to stay?" The question emerged barely above a whisper, laden with all the uncertainty and hope she dared not express more directly. Blake was silent for a long moment, the firelight playing across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows as he considered her words. "If you wanted to stay," he finally said, his voice low and rough with emotion, "I'd be the happiest man in California." The simple honesty of his response broke something open inside Maggie, a dam holding back feelings she had been too afraid to acknowledge. Before she could second-guess herself, she rose from her place by the fire and moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I think," she said carefully, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames, "that I would like to stay, at least for a while, to see if." She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the nebulous possibility taking shape between them. Blake's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers entwining with her smaller ones. To see if what's beginning here might grow into something more. Maggie's heart leaped at his understanding, at the gentle pressure of his hand around hers. "Yes," she admitted. "Exactly that." Blake lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles that sent a shiver down her spine. "Then we'll see," he promised, his eyes reflecting the same tentative hope she felt. Together. The next morning brought a shift in their relationship, subtle but unmistakable. A new awareness colored every interaction, every glance, every casual touch. They continued their journey west, but now there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that they were traveling toward something more significant than a plot of land in California. As they crossed into more populated areas, they began to hear news of the world beyond their immediate surroundings. A friendly settler who offered them shelter for a night spoke of boom towns springing up around mining operations, of the transcontinental railroad changing the face of travel, of opportunities for those willing to work hard and take risks. "The land my uncle left me is in the San Joaquin Valley," Blake explained as they studied a crude map the settler had drawn for them. "Good farmland, from what I've heard, fertile soil, decent rainfall. What will you grow?" Maggie asked, genuinely curious about the future he envisioned. Blake smiled, the expression coming more easily to him now. "Thought I'd try my hand at horses again. Good breeding stock can fetch a high price in these parts." "A horse ranch," Maggie mused, trying to picture it. "It suits you. And you?" Blake asked, his tone carefully casual though his eyes were intent on her face. "What would you like to do in California?" The question caught her off guard. In the whirlwind of leaving Cottonwood Springs and the long journey west, Maggie had given little thought to what her own future might hold beyond simply escaping her past. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I know business, running a store, keeping accounts, managing inventory. But I don't know if that's what I want anymore." Blake nodded, accepting her uncertainty without judgment. "There's time to figure it out. The valley has growing towns, places that need skilled people." He hesitated, then added, "Or there's the ranch. It'll need managing too. Accounts to keep, supplies to order. A partner who knows business would be valuable." The offer was there, unspoken but clear, a place by his side, not just as a traveling companion but as something more permanent. Maggie felt a warm flush of pleasure at the thought. "I'd like that," she said softly. "To help with the ranch, I mean, at least until I figure out what else I might want to do." Blake's smile widened, transforming his face in that way that never failed to catch her breath. "Good, that's good." They reached the San Joaquin Valley as winter was giving way to early spring, the landscape verdant with new growth after the winter rains. Blake's land, when they finally arrived, exceeded even his descriptions, a broad expanse of rolling grassland bordered by a clear, fast-flowing creek, with a distant view of mountains to the east. The only structure was a small, somewhat dilapidated cabin that had been his uncle's home, but the potential of the place was immediately apparent. "It's beautiful," Maggie breathed as they stood together on a small rise, surveying what would be their home. "I can see why your uncle chose it." Blake nodded, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and the weight of new responsibility. "Needs work," he observed, eyeing the cabin critically. "Lots of it. The roof won't last another winter, and we'll need proper stables if we're going to raise horses." "We'll manage," Maggie assured him, surprising herself with how naturally she included herself in his plans. One step at a time. The first few weeks were a blur of activity as they made the cabin habitable and began planning for more permanent improvements. They traveled to the nearest town, Riverdale, for supplies, establishing relationships with local merchants and introducing themselves to neighbors scattered across the valley. To Maggie's relief, no one in Riverdale knew or cared about her past in Cottonwood Springs. Here, she was simply Miss Zellner, the business partner of Mr. Jameson, the new rancher. If eyebrows raised at their unconventional living arrangement sharing the small cabin, though they were neither married nor related, no one commented directly. California, it seemed, was indeed a place for new beginnings. As spring deepened into summer, the ranch began to take shape. Blake purchased their first horses, 2 mares, and a stallion of good bloodlines, and spent long days building proper stables and fencing with the help of hired workers from town. Maggie established a vegetable garden, kept their accounts in meticulous order, and gradually transformed the cabin into a comfortable home. Their relationship evolved too, growing deeper and more complex with each passing day. The attraction between them remained, simmering beneath the surface of their everyday interactions, but neither seemed ready to take the final step that would irrevocably change what they had built together. Until one evening in late summer, when everything changed. They had been celebrating the completion of the new stable, a sturdy structure that represented months of hard work and the first major improvement to the property. A bottle of whiskey was opened, toasts were made, and as the hired workers departed for town, Maggie and Blake found themselves alone beneath a star-filled sky, the warm evening air heavy with the scent of dry grass and possibility. "Dance with me," Blake said suddenly, the request so unexpected that Maggie could only stare at him in surprise. "Here, now, there's no music," she pointed out, though she was already moving toward him, drawn by the rare playfulness in his expression. Blake hummed a tune, something slow and sweet that Maggie didn't recognize, and held out his arms. She stepped into them without hesitation, her hands finding their places naturally, one in his larger one, the other resting on his shoulder. His free hand settled at her waist, warm and steady through the fabric of her dress. They moved together in the starlight, turning slowly on the packed earth outside the cabin, the rhythm of Blake's humming guiding their steps. Maggie couldn't remember the last time she had danced, perhaps at a town social in Cottonwood Springs, years ago, before her father fell ill. She had certainly never danced like this, held close in the arms of a man who looked at her as if she were something precious and rare. "What's the song?" she asked, her voice hushed in the intimate space between them. Blake's humming paused. "Something my mother used to sing, a lullaby, I think." He resumed the tune for a moment, then stopped again. "Maggie," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "there's something I need to tell you." The change in his tone made her heart stutter. "What is it?" He drew back slightly, enough to look into her eyes while still holding her close. "These past months working beside you, building this place together, they've been the happiest I've known since I lost my family. And I realize now that it's not just the ranch or California or having a purpose again. It's you, it's being with you." Maggie's breath caught in her throat at the naked emotion in his voice, in his eyes. "Blake, let me finish," he said gently. "I need to say this. When we met, I thought I was helping you escape a bad situation. But the truth is, you saved me just as much as I might have saved you. You gave me something to care about again, something to hope for." His hand tightened slightly at her waist, drawing her imperceptibly closer. "I know our arrangement was as partners, and if that's all you want, I'll respect it. But I need you to know that for me, it's become much more than that. I love you, Maggie Zellner. I love your strength and your kindness and your determination. I love the way you hum when you're working in the garden and the way you furrow your brow when you're balancing the accounts. I love every part of you, and I would be honored if you'd consider making our partnership permanent." Tears sprang to Maggie's eyes, blurring her vision of his beloved face. For so long, she had told herself that there was no future for her, that the best she could hope for was to escape her past and find some measure of peace. She had never dared to imagine finding love, building a life with someone who truly saw her and loved her anyway. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking on the simple word. "Yes, I'll consider it. Yes, I love you too." Blake's face transformed with joy, the last traces of the guarded, wounded man she had met in Cottonwood Springs falling away. He lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing through tears. When he set her down, his hands framed her face with infinite tenderness. "May I kiss you, Maggie Zellner?" In answer, she rose on tiptoe, closing the distance between them and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as months of restrained longing found release. Maggie's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer as his hands slid to her waist, holding her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever touched. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I was beginning to think I'd never find the courage to tell you," he admitted. Maggie smiled, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. "I was beginning to think I'd have to tell you first." They were married 2 weeks later in Riverdale's small church, with the local reverend officiating and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Maggie wore a new dress of pale blue calico with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Blake wore the only suit he owned, newly pressed for the occasion, his usually unruly hair tamed and his face freshly shaved. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, each word of their vows infused with the weight of all they had overcome to reach this moment. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Blake kissed her with restrained tenderness before their small audience, Maggie felt as if she had finally, truly come home. Their wedding night was a revelation, awkward at times, as such first encounters often are, but filled with such tenderness and care that any momentary discomfort was quickly forgotten. Blake treated her body as the treasure he had declared her to be, his touches both reverent and increasingly bold as he learned what pleased her. And Maggie, overcoming her initial shyness, discovered the joy of giving and receiving pleasure with the man she loved. In the quiet aftermath, lying in Blake's arms as the moon cast silver light through the cabin's small window, Maggie marveled at the journey that had brought her here from the desperate young woman with a smoking shotgun in her hands to a rancher's wife with hope in her heart. "What are you thinking about?" Blake murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Everything," Maggie replied honestly. "How strange life is, how one moment can change everything." "If Frank Hollister hadn't come into the store that day, if you hadn't heard the shot and come to help." Blake pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I've thought about that too. What if I'd ridden through Cottonwood Springs the day before or the day after? We might never have met." "Do you believe in fate?" Maggie asked, tilting her head to look up at him. Blake considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. "I'm not sure," he finally said. "After I lost Sarah and Emma, my wife and daughter, I couldn't believe in anything good or purposeful in the world. It all seemed random and cruel." His arm tightened around her. "But then I found you, and sometimes I wonder." "What?" Maggie prompted when he trailed off. "If maybe there is some pattern to it all, some reason I had to lose everything to be ready to find you." He shook his head slightly. "That sounds foolish, I know." "No," Maggie disagreed, pressing closer to his warmth. "Not foolish, hopeful, and after everything, I think we've earned the right to hope." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Fall brought the first foal born on their ranch, a strong, spirited colt with a white blaze down his face. Blake was ecstatic, seeing in the newborn animal the beginning of the breeding program he had envisioned. Maggie found herself equally enchanted, spending hours in the stable watching the colt's wobbly first steps and his growing confidence. As winter approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of rain to the valley, Maggie began to suspect that another new life might be beginning. Her monthly courses, always regular as clockwork, were late. Her breasts felt tender, and certain smells that had never bothered her before now turned her stomach. She waited until she was certain before sharing her suspicion with Blake. On a crisp December evening, as they sat before the fire in their now comfortable cabin, she took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "I think," she said softly, watching his face, "that our family might be growing." Blake's expression transformed from momentary confusion to stunned wonder as her meaning registered. "A baby," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You're sure?" Maggie nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears at his reaction. "As sure as I can be without the doctor's confirmation." "But all the signs are there." Blake let out a whoop of joy that startled their dog, a stray they had adopted from town. He lifted Maggie from her chair and into his arms, spinning her around as he had the night he first declared his love, his face alight with happiness. "Easy," Maggie laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "If I wasn't certain before, I will be after all this spinning." Blake immediately set her down, his expression comically contrite. "I'm sorry, I didn't hurt you, did I, or the baby?" "We're fine," Maggie assured him, touched by his instant concern. "Both of us." Blake knelt before her, his hands coming to rest with infinite gentleness on her waist. "A baby," he repeated, the wonder still evident in his voice. "Our baby." He pressed a reverent kiss to her stomach through the fabric of her dress, then looked up at her with such love that it took her breath away. Thank you, Maggie, for everything, for coming with me, for loving me, for this incredible gift. Tears spilled freely down Maggie's cheeks now, tears of joy and overwhelming love for this man who had saved her in so many ways. I should be thanking you, she said, her fingers threading through his hair. You gave me a future when I thought I had none. Blake rose to his feet, gathering her close again, this time with exquisite care. No, he disagreed gently. I just showed you the path. You chose to walk it, brave as always. He kissed her softly, then added, and now we're making that future together day by day. The months of Maggie's pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Blake threw himself into expanding their home, adding a proper bedroom for the baby and improving the cabin's comfort for his growing family. Maggie sewed tiny garments and planned for the child's arrival, her body changing as the new life within her grew. Spring came again to the valley, bringing with it wildflowers and the birth of more foals, the ranch's reputation for quality horseflesh beginning to spread. And then, on a warm May evening as the sun was setting over their land, Maggie felt the first contractions that signaled their child was ready to join the world. The birth was long and difficult, testing Maggie's strength and Blake's composure as he assisted the midwife they had arranged to stay with them in the final weeks. But as dawn broke the following morning, their daughter made her entrance with a lusty cry that proclaimed her healthy and strong. "She's perfect," Blake whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with hands that trembled slightly, his eyes never leaving the small red face partially hidden by the blanket. Absolutely perfect. Exhausted but radiant, Maggie watched her husband with their child, her heart so full it seemed impossible it could contain so much love. "What shall we call her?" she asked, though they had discussed names extensively in the preceding months. Blake looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Emma," he suggested tentatively, "after my first daughter, but only if you're comfortable with that," he added quickly. "We can choose something else. Emma is beautiful," Maggie interrupted gently, understanding the significance of his suggestion. "Emma Margaret Jameson." For both the women who came before her, Blake's smile was tremulous but genuine. "Your mother would be proud, so would mine." He carefully returned their daughter to Maggie's arms, "And I have never been prouder or more in love than I am at this moment, looking at my wife and daughter." As Emma settled against her breast, her tiny fist waving in the air before finding her mouth, Maggie felt a sense of completion she had never known possible. From the ashes of her life in Cottonwood Springs, from the despair that had gripped her as she stood over Frank Hollister's body, from the certainty that she had no future worth claiming, from all of this had come the most profound joy, the most perfect peace. "I love you," she told Blake, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you for our daughter, for our home, for every promise you've kept." Blake leaned down to press a kiss to her forehead, then to the downy head of their sleeping daughter. "And I love you both," he replied. "More than I have words to express." As the sun rose fully over their ranch, bathing the small family in golden light, Maggie Jameson reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her here. Once, she had believed herself to be a woman with no future. Now she held that future in her arms, secure in the love of a man who had promised her forever and given her the most precious gift of all, not just a child, but a life filled with purpose, with joy, with the certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Outside, a new day dawned on the ranch they had built with their own hands. Inside, a new life slept peacefully, unaware of the journey that had brought her parents together or the love that had created her. And between them, Blake and Maggie shared a look of perfect understanding, a silent acknowledgement of all they had overcome and all they had yet to experience in the forever they had promised each other. In the years that followed, the Jameson Ranch prospered, becoming known throughout California for its fine horses. Emma grew into a spirited, intelligent girl with her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's determined nature. She was joined by two brothers, Thomas, named for Maggie's father, and James, a nod to Blake's family name. The cabin expanded into a proper ranch house with wide porches and enough rooms for their growing family. Maggie established a small library in town, using her business acumen to secure funding and donations. fulfilling a dream she hadn't known she harbored until California gave her the freedom to discover it. Blake's quiet competence and integrity earned him the respect of neighbors and business associates alike, and he was eventually elected to the town council, where his thoughtful approach to governance proved valuable during Riverdale's rapid growth. There were challenges, of course, drought years that tested their resources, a fire that nearly claimed the stables, illness that swept through the valley one harsh winter. But through it all, the promise Blake had made that night in Cottonwood Springs held true. He had offered Maggie a future when she believed she had none, and together they had built a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge over their land, Maggie would think back to the desperate young woman she had been, standing with a smoking shotgun in a dusty store, certain that her life was over. How wrong she had been, how fortunate that a taciturn cowboy with his own ghosts to lay to rest had heard the shot and come to help. "What are you thinking about?" Blake would ask, noticing her pensive expression, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. And Maggie would smile, squeezing his fingers in silent gratitude for the question he never tired of asking, for the genuine interest he never ceased to show in her thoughts, her dreams, her very being. "About how endings can sometimes be beginnings in disguise," she might answer. Or simply, "About how lucky I am to have found you." And Blake, the lines around his eyes deepening with his smile, would raise her hand to his lips in a gesture that had never lost its power to quicken her heartbeat. "Not luck," he would correct gently. "Fate, destiny. The universe putting right what once went wrong." Together they would sit, watching the stars wheel overhead, secure in the knowledge that the future they had forged together would endure in their children, in their land, in the love that had transformed two broken souls into something whole and beautiful and enduring. A love that had begun with a gunshot and a stranger's kindness, and blossomed into a forever neither had dared to dream possible.